It was after his third unsuccessful job interview that month that Brannigan found the gallery. He wasn't at all familiar with the town. He'd taken more than an hour's bus journey into the countryside to get here, and the interview had taken much less time than he'd expected. Even if he'd wanted to head straight back home, there wasn't another direct bus for well over an hour, and besides which he would rather wait until his wife Madeline was there to give him some kind of comfort. No. If he couldn't find something to pass the time, then he really was as useless as he was starting to fear he might be. Beyond the shops that lined the main road, hills rose dramatically towards a sky that seemed to be lowering itself to brush them with greyness. Narrow terraces of cottages led halfway up the hills and stopped there as though exhausted by the climb. After climbing one only to find himself becoming entangled in a maze of dour-looking cramped cottages, even the view was cut off from him, and he doubted whether there could be anything worthwhile in the streets when he found it. Or it found him. He saw the sign first, hand-painted, old and flaking. "Gallery," it announced modestly. As he walked nearer, his first thought was that the attraction had been removed from the street. On either side of the sign were long abandoned shops, the size and shape of the houses he'd been walking past. Beneath the sign was simply a hole in the terrace, as though the first story of a building had been excised like a tumour. On closer inspection, it became clear that the sign was leading him down an alleyway. Cobbles slick with rainwater and ooze less clearly identified led into what looked like a communal backyard for the empty buildings, open only to the bleak grey sky above. Something moved, clattering from a mound of fallen bricks, a cat blacker and thinner than its own shadow. It turned its one yellow eye towards him before bounding onto the wall above and disappearing into the rooftops. He moved slowly down the alleyway, noticing a repetition of a gallery sign above a doorway halfway along. The door looked as unused as anything else in this part of town. The paintwork had faded like a memory, the handle had rusted, and the single pane of glass set into the wood was cracked and repaired with tape. That was that then, and he turned to leave, somewhat disappointed and yet somehow relieved. But before he'd taken another step, he heard a furtive scrabbling from behind the door, and a light came on, barely illuminating the murky glass. So there was somebody in the gallery, and that could only mean it was open. At least now he would have some better way to waste his time than threading his way deeper into a maze of increasingly desolate streets. He grabbed hold of a door handle, a sensation that was unpleasantly less solid than it ought to have been, and opened the door, stepping into the gallery. At first there was only darkness, then a smell so musty and overpowering that it was like being buried. Had his eyes tricked him into believing there was light in the building? Even the daylight was too weak to follow him across the threshold. Brannigan caught his breath. Both the smell and his unease held him immobile. But then the light bulb above his head flickered and afforded him a glimpse of a starved and hungry-looking creature that was waiting for him, arms without hands raised above its head. He stepped back, unwilling to be left in the dark with such a vision, but the door had already swung shut behind him and his reaching hands found nothing to grasp. The light flickered again, but this time it stayed on, and he found himself staring at a wasted-looking man who, of course, could not have been waiting in the dark for him. "Oh, I'm sorry," Brannigan spluttered, caught between trying to flee and not wanting to turn his back on that hungry expression. I thought, that is, you are open, aren't you?" The gallery owner, if that's what he was, let a grin spread across his face. A grin so wide and so slow that Brannigan thought it might not end until it reached either side of his head. His teeth were long, thin and discoloured. A silver fuzz of beard lined his gaunt face. His skull was otherwise hairless and dark-skinned. Though he looked old and his stooped posture was that of someone twisted by age, his face was unlined, unnaturally smooth. Deep-set eyes stared out at him, small and round and yellowed. "My visions are waiting for you," the man replied, though almost as soon as he'd spoken, Brannigan was dismayed to find that he could not remember the sound of his voice. The room in which they stood was small, a rudimentary hallway composed as much of dust as of damp-looking plaster. A corridor led into what must be the main part of the gallery. Beside this was a small table that served as a counter and a stool that he thought the gallery owner was wiser not to risk perching on. He noticed that the man's hands were unnaturally smooth, totally unlined like his face, and yet there was something even stranger about them. They were pink, and the fingers joined together and slightly curved into a permanent cupped position. With unease, he realized that the man's hands were plastic. He stumbled forwards, embarrassed and feeling like a spotlight had been turned on him. Of course, he needn't feel this way. He'd hardly been staring, but all the same, he reached into his overcoat pocket and blurted out, "How much?" "However much you think this may be worth to you," was the only reply. He must mean that the gallery relied on voluntary donations, though heaven knew how that would help when Brannigan could not imagine it ever being less empty than it was now. Not sure whether this ought to make him pay more or less than he might otherwise have done, he fished out whatever loose change the bus ride had left him with, not very much, he had to admit, and held it towards the gallery owner, but the other man just raised his plastic hands out of reach and said, "Please leave your donation in the basket." Brannigan did so, dropping the coins into an otherwise empty basket on the tabletop, wondering if he was to be judged on his charity, but the other man's eyes never left his own. "Now let's see what I can give to you," he said, as he stepped back out of the way. If nothing else, the rest of the gallery would provide a respite from a strange character's company, and Brannigan was determined not to feel rushed. He stepped into the stubby corridor that led from the foyer. Darkness made it seem much smaller than it surely was, but each of the 4 rooms that seemed to open onto it, 2 doorways on either side, revealed light, and he hurried into the nearest as eager as a moth to a flame. This room was windowless, like the foyer, and only a little larger. Another door led on into the next room. The plaster was similarly unpainted or painted in white, which had dirtied over time. The light bulb was too dim and coated in dust for him to be certain. Really, what kind of place was this in which to enjoy art? He chuckled softly to himself, imagining the tale he would have to tell Madeline that evening. On each wall hung a single framed piece of artwork. He stepped forward to appraise the first. A photograph, hardly art at all, a very old and very faded portrait of a man and a woman, formally dressed and holding a baby between them. Was there something more that he was supposed to be seeing, or did the gallery owner have some personal reason for hanging this piece here? Was it his family portrait? With a shrug, Brannigan moved on to the next. Immediately he was uncertain whether this was better or worse than the last piece. It looked no more than the daubings of a child, or at least an attempt to recreate the perspective of one. As the viewer, he was staring up into a world that was the familiar grown larger and more threatening. Towering figures on the edges of a painting seemed to lean towards him, full of warning, but he really wasn't interested and moved on to the last 2 pictures in the room. Here was a dog, abstractly done, but still recognizable as such. It was either sleeping in a flower bed or dead and commemorated with wreaths. The next was somewhat better. A bleak and lonely seascape, a small spit of shingle, empty except for a childlike figure staring out at crashing waves beneath a brooding sky. There was a title beneath this one, though he had to squint to be able to read it. A strip of paper cut from a lined pad and the words printed in ink. "I learn I am alone. Brannigan stepped back to look at the painting again. He both liked and disliked it at once. Undoubtedly it was well wrought, but the atmosphere of solitude it conjured was unnerving. At least it had moved him, which he supposed was what art was meant to do, but he still hoped for better as he stepped through into the next room. This was similar to the previous one, except for a window that was blocked up from the outside, and the other doorway in here must lead him back out into the main corridor. He'd find out soon enough, because the light in here was flickering too. The plasterwork seemed to shift, creating the unwelcome impression that the room was falling down around him. At least the walls held more art this time, 2 or 3 pieces on each, ranging from something a little larger than a postage stamp to a canvas so large he wondered how long the crumbling wall would hold it. The first that Brannigan came to appeared purely black. No doubt the light here didn't help with whatever subtleties the painting might conceal. He craned forward and then jerked back with a gasp, for as the light had flickered dramatically behind him, a pair of claw-like hands had reached for his head from the murky depths. An unfortunate optical illusion, of course, for now that the bulb had fallen back into simply sputtering dimly, he could no longer distinguish anything so obvious in the dark palette the artist had used. But the larger part of him would have been reassured to. He stepped further away from the wall. Every corner of a room was lost in shadow. Truly, this was no kind of environment to linger in. He wondered at the mindset of anyone who would. Even if that meant no one but the gallery owner, then that was still one mind he would want no part of. Perhaps thinking about the man had roused him, for here he came stumbling through the gallery. Brannigan could hear him in the room that he'd just left. Unwilling to draw the man's attention, he returned to studying the paintings with an interest that he hoped looked more genuine than it felt. Again, some of them looked as though they'd been produced by a child, or perhaps a mind that had less excuse to be so unformed. Canvases had been no less than attacked by the paint. The red colours were like slashed wounds trying to find a victim to belong to amongst the subjects. Of the subjects themselves, he could make out little, or at least little that made any sense. This one, for example, only a spider could have so many limbs, but why would it look so terrified by owning them, and would they cause it to be in so much pain? Here was a forest, though, one in which the trees were in various stages of becoming human, or at least creatures resembling human. Though crudely executed, this made the vision all the more unsettling because of the mindless expressions of hatred on their faces. The gallery owner was still in the last room. Indeed, he seemed to be having trouble finding his way out, for the only sign of him was the sound of slapping on the walls. Brannigan pictured him stumbling through the gloom, plastic hands scraping at the walls, and he hurried through the doorway to put further distance between them. Something was wrong. This doorway should have led him back into the main corridor of the building, but instead he was in the smallest and worst lit room yet. If they carried on like this, he'd end up in a coffin. What a thought to have! He tried to ignore it and looked to the exit. He'd had enough of this kind of culture for one day, for a lifetime in fact, but he didn't want to head back towards the gallery owner, stumbling and scraping in the shadows. It struck him then, was it not likely that the man was the artist responsible for all this work? If so, then that was even more of a reason not to be left in the dark with him. There had to be something wrong with a mind that could produce such nightmares. He couldn't believe such things were being paraded as art. Though Brannigan was no lover of art, he thought the very least it would need to be was skillful or even pleasant to look at. These strange works were neither. Misty grey blurs rose from the depths of the canvases, too formless to be called figures, even if some of them appeared to be arranging faces on whatever they had in place of heads. He turned away. The light was so poor that he was having trouble distinguishing the edges of canvases. The shapes seemed to be rising out of the very walls, swimming in the shadows. On the next wall he saw rains of fire, a child eating its own eyes as it crawled from its mother's womb. Lovers turned to ice as they fucked, and children that should have been dead, judging by how burned they looked, attacked adults. Here was something that had once been a man, buried alive in a space that barely gave it room to scream. Dogs turned on men, men turned on dogs, and those barely formed faces were everywhere he looked, expressions of undistilled hatred or terror, crudely yet effectively realized. When the pitiful voice cried out, Brannigan could almost believe that he'd become lost in the nightmare world that the paintings were windows onto. And then he remembered the gallery owner stumbling clumsily through the darkened rooms. Though part of him was saying he should investigate, or at least call out to offer help if it were needed, he wanted only to be out of here now and catching his bus ride home, to familiar surroundings and to his wife. He looked again for another way out, trying not to notice any more of the horrendous images that grew like rot in this building. More than ever now, he believed they were the work of one man. The style of them, if such a word could be used, was gruesomely similar. Such a person needed help, all right, but not the kind that he could provide. And then he remembered the man's immobile plastic hands, and he felt very cold inside. There was another door, though so small it was barely that. Nevertheless, he thrust himself through it, a narrow gap in the wall. He was reminded of a screaming creature buried alive. Already the seeds of the pictures were sown and the nightmares were growing in his brain. He no longer knew where he was, the last of the 4 rooms or back into the corridor at last. But as long as he kept moving, he could find a way out of here. He must try not to panic. Easier said than done. He found himself in the smallest and darkest room yet. Indeed, this was lit only by the dim, unsteady glow cast through the narrow doorway behind him. Because what hung from the ceiling in this room was not a light bulb. And whatever was coming towards him through the rooms, pounding at the walls and crying out in frustrated hunger, was not the gallery owner, the artist of the nightmares. It could not be him, for the man had hanged himself from the exposed rafters of this room. Brannigan became aware then of several things all at once. Things which he knew were important, but then his conscious mind dare not think about until he was gone from here. As his eyes darted about to look for means of escape in this final room that offered no other doorway, he allowed himself to become distracted, however briefly, by only one more thing. A final frame hung in the gallery, and he stepped towards it, needing to see what remained to be seen. It took him some moments to realize that what he was looking at was a mirror, for the face that stared back at him looked every bit as unnatural and haunted as everything else he'd seen in this awful place. It was his eyes, most of all, he realized, as he pushed himself away from the flaking wall, unwilling to believe that his reflection was not following quite as quickly as it should. There had been something wrong with his eyes. The eyes had not been his. He fell against the next wall, and it sagged under his weight. Was the gallery coming to some kind of life? No, the wall was soft with mould. It looked bruised with it, and now he had a means of escape. He began punching and kicking at the plaster. Whatever it was back there, it bellowed again in rage, an angry and formless sound seemingly torn from a soul that had known only pain. But Brannigan was past distraction. He had knocked a hole in the plaster and was tearing at the wall, flinging aside handfuls of material that felt pulpy as diseased flesh. The artist had been driven mad by his visions. That had to explain his taking his own life. But Brannigan couldn't help think that his art was more than just a means of trying to exorcise his nightmares. Indeed, could it be a way of passing them on? The hole in the wall was big enough to struggle through now, and he did so, pushing aside more of it as he urged himself onwards. It took a while to recognise the room in which he emerged, for though he had thought it scarcely possible, it seemed even more aged and neglected than when he'd entered the gallery. There was the table, the man's chair, the basket with Brannigan's coins as dull as unearthed antiquities. There was the door to the alleyway. The last of the afternoon light lay beyond it, and he drove himself towards it. As his hands grasped at the latch, he found the temptation to look back over his shoulder unbearable. As he'd been making his way through the gallery, he found it strange that he hadn't at any time cut across the corridor that dissected the building, and indeed, looking back now, he could see no sign of anything but bare, decaying wall, apart from the hole he'd fought his way through. But even worse than that, and the lingering question of whether or not the artist had removed his own hands to prevent any more of his nightmares finding form, was what was staring at him through that hole, eyes afire with some kind of triumph. He didn't believe in ghosts, Brannigan thought as he turned away and struggled to open the door with hands that felt as useless as lumps of plastic. But even if he had, he couldn't imagine what kind of afterlife could leave one so physically twisted and altered. As it opened what had become of its mouth to roar its newfound agony, he managed to open the door and tumble out into the cobbled alleyway. It was dark out here, so much darker than it ought to be. There mustn't be something wrong with his eyes. He remembered what he thought he'd seen in the reflection back there, but now that he was out of the gallery, he had to be free of whatever atmosphere and influence it had. He rubbed at his eyes. Perhaps he was just tired. Perhaps he'd grown accustomed to the gloom and staggered down the alleyway towards the street whilst he could still see. He couldn't lose his sight. That was a ridiculous idea, no less nightmarish than anything he had experienced in the gallery. The idea of simply never being able to see again was bad enough. But it didn't bear thinking about what he would be trapped in that darkness with. Perhaps he could hold on to his sight long enough to find his way out of a maze of streets and back down the hill to where his bus would be waiting. Beyond that, there was home and his wife. As reassuring as those thoughts should have been to him, he couldn't help but wonder just how long he'd be able to live with the nightmares of a madman in his mind.